Let's keep us on time. All right, so today I have the pleasure of introducing Michelle Mashburn, who is the founder of the organization All Things Disability Equity. Michelle's going to talk about her presentation, Beyond Inclusion, Building Disability Equity in Libraries.
Hi, everybody. I have to be careful with the microphone here. So I'm here today to talk about shifting from compliance to transformation, because access alone isn't going to ensure accessibility for disabled people. Okay. I also want to thank you all for the opportunity to present and to share my lived experience and expertise in disability awareness and disability management stuff. My name's Michelle Mashburn. As Rebecca said, I'm the founder of All Things Disability Equity. I am also a disability advocate, activist, consultant, and a trainer. So All Things Disability Equity drives systemic change by centering leadership of disabled people. And we focus on designing access from the start rather than adding it in later, ultimately because access needs are human needs, and we need to remember that. The mission of All Things Disability Equity is we strive to eliminate ableism through education, leadership development, and then, of course, disability-informed inclusive practices. And ultimately, it's to create meaningful change. One quick caveat, this is educational, for educational reasons. I'm not an attorney, I'm not a medical provider, so this is not legal, nor is it medical advice. Oh, and I can do a brief image description on this. This is me talking at a park. It was actually a fundraising event to increase funds for an inclusive park in the city of San Jose at the Rotary Garden. And I was invited to speak, using my lived experience to kind of amplify what they were trying to do with their repair budget. So I want to do a quick access check-in, before we dive in. I want to remind everybody it's okay to show up in a way that works for you. And the space should meet where you are in this moment in time. I recognize that we're still in your work environment, and there are professional norms that some people will have to do at different levels than others. But ultimately, I want the space to be as supportive for everyone, to just be supportive to you. You're welcome to sit, stand, stretch, lay down. This is the one that's always kind of, you can't do this if you're in a professional space probably as easily as other spaces. You're welcome to move around, step out if you need a break, stim or fidget, use your devices as needed. We all engage and process information in very different ways, and there's no single right way to be present with me. So just really quickly, are there any unmet access needs at this time within the room? You can either raise your hand or you can talk to the planners at the desk in the back if there's a need that you have. This could be climate. It could be that you can't hear very well. It could be I'm not talking into the microphone, which I am probably going to struggle with for most of this session. But are there any unmet needs? I also want to be really clear about something. I see the hard work that libraries are doing, and you're doing important work, essential work in our communities. I see you working towards ADA and compliance and accessibility as you understand them. But there's always these gaps, and there's gaps of knowledge, there's gaps of awareness, and that's just part of the learning curve or part of the process. You're creating welcoming environments, though, and inclusive programming. You're training staff on disability awareness, or otherwise I wouldn't be here today. And you're investing in different assistive technology devices and other resources. I also love that my local library purchases the disability authors, like children's books with disability in it, things along those lines. And these are all very important things. So this presentation isn't really about libraries not trying. I do believe most of you work in good faith to serve your whole community, including people with disabilities. But good intentions and compliance actually don't really create an inclusive space. And it's not always enough. And ultimately, that's because of a deeper issue of structural ableism in our society. This is something that we're born into, we're socialized to believe, and over time, we sometimes can find a pathway to unlearn it, but oftentimes we're not aware when ableism is coming up and what we're doing and how we're doing it. So this basically requires us to think differently about the problems we're trying to solve. So let's kind of start by looking at some of where those gaps show up. Yeah, I think that presented, I'm one slide ahead here. Go back. There we go. There's a delay. It's like, oh. So disabled people often struggle to fully show up in library spaces. And sometimes I'm known to avoid them entirely. I know everybody's busy doing a lot of different things. Who wants to deal with the vocal person saying the bathroom's not accessible, or that their event space isn't set up in a way that I can navigate? You know, and this happens regardless of how hard the library is trying. Well-meaning efforts sometimes miss what people with disabilities actually need. Libraries may rely on outdated terminology, such as special needs or differently abled, which is actually more harmful as a person gets older. It works for certain populations, but as somebody ages, that will strip me of my rights. You know, if I'm in a room and somebody says, oh, we serve people with special needs, that's not gonna help me very much. You know, and the other thing is flawed models of disability. Models of disability are like the framework that an organization takes towards how you deal with disabled community members and disabled residents. So, you know, you might have accessibility features that you notice aren't being used. And it's like, why aren't these being used? Or programming that's technically inclusive and or accessible, but nobody's showing up, or it doesn't work for the people that you're trying to serve. Access needs also can compete. Competing access needs is an interesting concept because for some people, we like it warm in a room. For other people, we like it cooler in a room. If somebody has a disability, they may want to be in a quiet space, or they may need a louder space. And how do we make that work in a library space? Because there's a lot of people with a lot of competing access needs, regardless of whether they're disabled or not. So too often, the focus is on accommodating rather than transforming the system. We want to retrofit solutions, and in many spaces, we have to retrofit solutions. Because even though I have access to this stage today, ultimately, this space, while it was probably very transformative when it was first created, it doesn't give me power of very much choice, especially when you deal with the room dynamics as well. And these are things that you're not familiar with unless you actually have somebody in your life, or you're connected with somebody, or you have a disability. So ultimately, you know, when we're retrofitting, we have to kind of create a guide or a gauge of how to see what we're trying to do. So the reality is there's often this disconnect between the policy and the lived experience that leaves everyone kind of frustrated. And that disconnect is what I want to talk about more today. I'm going to start out by talking about some of the barriers so that we can have a better understanding of some of these barriers. They're historic. Okay. We all needed that laugh, right? So there are historic and systemic barriers. Structural ableism is structural. It's baked into our policies, our laws. You know, ableism is a pervasive belief that non-disabled bodies and minds are superior. It's also the pervasive belief that that is normal. Because I am not abnormal because I am disabled, but ultimately society often views me that way. That is ableism. You know, it shapes every aspect of our lives. Like I said, we're socialized into it. We also have a legacy of eugenics in America that actually is part of what the, eugenics that happened in Germany was modeled after. That eugenics is currently on a rise again, following the pandemic, along with other things, the policies that are getting pushed forward. There's active campaigns to say people with disabilities are burdens in our society. So, you know, we really have to look at the intersectional oppression that exists. And I was thinking about this with Rebecca. I said this to Rebecca. If you guys were actually trying to get my presentation funded, all of my words would be on the do not use list, you know, and it would be very difficult to do because, like, this next statement is intersectional oppression means colonialism, racism, sexism, heterosexism, and other forms of oppression will compound the barriers a person experiences. So as I said, wouldn't get you funded, at least not today, but that's okay. Other thing is socioeconomic barriers. And here's the thing, with disability, poverty is both the cause and the consequence of disability. So disabled people are 2.5 times more likely to live in poverty than non-disabled people. This isn't just individual circumstance either. Again, it's a structural issue. There are benefit traps, there are employment barriers, there are discrimination, there's refusal to accommodate or inadequate accommodations. And these are agreed upon and they're sanctioned really by most levels, whether it's your boss or your boss's boss, or it's baked into law, the law of the town or the city or the county or the state or the federal government, you know, this country as a whole. There's also extra costs with disability. There's disability tax is what it's called within the disability community. What it costs for me to manage my wheelchair, what it costs for me to have my access needs and medical needs kind of met. It's a higher expense bracket, and that's not factored into things like minimum wage and living wage. So these are important variables, and I'll get to the reason of why these are important for us to consider as we continue along. But then there's also administrative burdens. The paperwork I have to do to get from one system to another system to another system, that adds time and energy. I recently spoke at a town hall where they had largely not included what disabled people needed in this time of crisis that so many communities are in. And so I was given the microphone, an opportunity to speak, and I was like, what we need is if you have somebody in your neighborhood, just take the extra time to say, hey, can I run an errand for you? Hey, can I do this? And I actually see this as a large part of what libraries do, kind of by creating those central hubs and resource shares and things like that, that becomes really important, and it's a simple step that can help kind of break down some of that extra work people have. So the other thing is poverty is intergenerational. You have disabled parents that can't build well because of these extra economic and administrative burdens. And then you have family members with disabled children that are having to funnel so much money not into only funding their life, but to fund their child's life for the rest of their life with the high support needs or moderate support needs that that individual may have. The other thing is barriers around accessibility. If a person can't participate, if I can't get there. Now, for me, access includes also things like how expensive is it for my assistive technology? How expensive is the buses? How comprehensive is the transportation system? Can I get there? You know, those are all barriers that I deal with on a regular. You have high assistive technology costs. You have inaccessible public transit. If anybody's familiar with paratransit services, which is like a door-to-door service, that's a pain in the butt, and it's really, really, really not very comprehensive. It's essential to have, but the program needs to be modified and improved. And until that point, I struggle with transportation. Healthcare facilities are still largely inaccessible. Airlines, people talk about flying to DC like it's the easy thing to do. I'm not getting on a plane in the next probably 10 to 15 years unless I absolutely have to. Wheelchairs are broken at staggering rates. And they're actually delaying, well, they're totally not doing the revisions. The disabled bill of, the travel bill of rights or whatever was actually rescinded recently as well. And this kind of boils down to the discrimination. And as I said about structural ableism, the discrimination is largely unconscious. You know, we're not aware of it. It's not like we're deliberately hating people with disabilities, but we also don't know how to interact with them. We don't know how to engage with them. There's microaggressions, and then there's assumptions. And some of those assumptions factor out into the programs that we build. So disabled people advocating for themselves, disabled people filing lawsuits to fight for access, we're often said we're difficult or demanding or we just need to go away. We're a burden to somebody else. And I realize everybody's jobs are busy and you're busy doing the work that you're doing and it's essential work. And this is where we have to think kind of more in advance about disability to make sure when we get to that crunch point, the disabled person is also not left behind. So on this slide, and I think people will have access to the slide after the event, there's a report that's the State of the State California Disability Policy in 2024 that was done by Disability Rights California at the end of last year. This has pretty much all of the content you would need to substantiate most of the claims that I just made. So it's a good resource. It includes statistics of prevalence of adults with disabilities and children with disabilities here in California. Yay, it moved forward. So, you know, how do we address the disconnect? That's ultimately the question. I'm hoping in this session I will provide with you a framework for spotting where disabled people are missing and or struggling and why that's happening. We look at the barriers that we just talked about and how they intersect to limit participation. We also explore how compliance and even inclusion can fall short if we don't address the underlying systems. Finally, I'll give you I have a handout that we'll hopefully have time to do an exercise towards the end. If not, the handout will be mailed, will be sent out in the packets after the session. That gives you just a tool at kind of reflecting on where the barriers are. And hopefully to start people thinking on how you can design spaces and services that work not just for disabled people, but for everybody. So this is an image of me at my past workplace. It's a small nonprofit in downtown San Jose. It's a social justice organization. And they were forward-thinking enough at one point, shortly before I started working there, to get this portable lift out in back, which allowed people with disabilities or wheelchair users or people that couldn't do stairs to actually get into the room. Granted, I think at the time I was hired, nobody really knew how to operate it, so it's a good thing that you learn these things fairly quickly when you're disabled of how to figure the machinery out. But one day, and this was after a couple of years I'd been there, I was the director at that point and I was mostly managing the space. I came to the center and the wheelchair lift was left in the up position. Trust me, there's almost no reason to leave it in the up position, but I found out from the group that utilized the space the night before that they thought that was going to be safer for the building, even though there was a locked gate on the parking lot. Anyway, this is an example where I had an accommodation request of physical access to a building, but yet the accommodation request alone did not gain me entry into the building. So portable lifts are portable because if you fix it into a place, you then have to pay for elevator permits and annual inspections and things like that. So it doesn't have the button at the bottom that calls it back down or a button at the top that calls it back up. By design, this is a great tool that kind of falters at different times, especially if it's a multi-use kind of tool. So compliance was achieved. This met the bar of compliance. They had accessibility into the building. They didn't even technically always have independent accessibility into the building because if I was there, other people with disabilities would come and the lift would be in the up position. We eventually installed a doorbell, a portable doorbell, so that people could ring the doorbell so we would know to bring it down to allow them to come back up. So anyways, it shows that just checking a legal box doesn't mean that people can access. And it definitely doesn't mean that people can belong in that space. So quick question, how many of you all have heard of the curb cut effect? A large number of people. So for those that haven't, here's the basic idea. Curb cut effect started actually in Berkeley, where a bunch of disabled people were congregating regularly, and they pushed to have the city put the curb cuts in to allow them to go from place to place. But then they ended up that the curb cuts help everybody, and that's what this graphic kind of shows. There's one person in a wheelchair, there's a parent pushing a stroller, there's some kids on bicycles, there's a delivery person, there's, to me, the two people sitting on the bench look like seniors, But because the curb cut's there, everybody can use it to their benefit. And this is the beauty of designing for disability. And this is also present when we talk about like disaster preparedness or disaster response. When we plan for those at most risk, those placed at most risk in society, we end up improving the response, not just for that group, but ultimately for everybody. So to start out on this, I want to explain the graphic on the side. This is a graphic done by Disabled by Society, which is two people in the UK that I wish I could just absorb their brains and take on some of their knowledge. Jamie is one of them, and the graphic is where does ableism show up? And these graphics are actually, there's multiple ones of these that are offered as a free resource for people. You might need to reach out for permission, of course, attribute them. But they're great because of their simplicity. So this says, where does ableism show up? It shows up in the workplace, in recruitment. It shows up in language, in healthcare. It shows up online, in social media, in education. Shows up when we design, because we bring the ableism with us, it's gonna automatically show up everywhere. And when I explain these images in these ways, some of what I'm doing is also an accessibility kind of hack that I do. I like to share as much information on my slides as possible in the event that somebody either is low vision or they're misunderstanding why I want to have something there, but it just is an overall modeling kind of disability inclusive behaviors in a way that can be beneficial. So now kind of onto this slide, which I actually reduced. I took a whole lot out of it. I realize that now. We talk about compliance, we talk about accessibility, we talk about inclusion, and we talk about equity. But oftentimes what we don't realize is each one does not guarantee the next. And sometimes we can have one without any of the other ones. But how do we build where we have equal and equitable opportunity for people in our society? And I'm not just talking disabled people, even though that is my focus most of the time. So compliance will often meet the legal requirements. We'll get an ADA ramp, we'll get a free space under sinks, but believe it or not, if people don't realize that free space under the sinks is for a reason, people put storage stuff there, or worse, they put a trash bin in the ADA stall, and then I'm having to dump trash all over everywhere when I flip my chair to kind of situate myself so that I'm comfortable, and able to transfer over. So these are examples of where access may fail in practice because of that lack of awareness. Now with technical accessibility is about technicalities. It's the technology, ramps, lifts, accessible websites, flexible seating, rooms that, rooms rarely accommodate full access. I've learned in the last, I'd say 4 or 5 years that I literally, if I want to do an event someplace, I have to ask for an ADA setup. And if I ask for an ADA setup, I may only have access, like in this room, to the very front of the room, as opposed to being able to go into the session, into the aisles to talk with other people. So I'm very limited to the outer periphery. So automatically, my inclusion by design is limited. which brings up inclusion, of how can people feel welcome and how can they participate when structurally or financially the barriers still block their access and full engagement. Social and cultural barriers absolutely need to be addressed, and it's an ongoing process. So that brings me kind of to equity, or my definition of disability equity, because up until recently, we haven't heard those two words put together. It's been disability inclusion or disability accessibility. There is a disability justice model that is a whole nother framework that I'll kind of add at the end. But you know, equity for me, for people with disabilities, is about power and life chance. It's about me having a decision, a voice that is involved in those decision-making. So it's like, also it's about designing the system or the program from the start to prevent the barriers, and making sure I have influence over decisions that affect me. And trust me, in most decisions in society, they are directly and sometimes indirectly impacting disabled people. So access, participation, power end up being built in and not retrofitting. Because trust me, when you retrofit a solution, you're doing double, if not triple, the amount of work. So on this slide, I have a graphic of, it's done by CBM Inclusion Group, which is, or Inclusion Advisory Group. It's a UN-based, United Nations-based organization that is a disability-led organization. So on that graphic, it's like, it says, you know, that structural gaps and contextual barriers prevent people with disabilities from participating even in the most inclusive programs. And you've got well-meaning, I'm going to say librarians, because I'm here today with librarians saying, you know, come join our program, we welcome all. And you've got two disabled people over here. But in between them, you have societal barriers that people with disabilities deal with every day. You have inadequate transportation. You have lack of assistive technology, or technology's gotten outdated, or it's no longer functional or integratable with other devices. You know, you have discriminatory attitudes. So these structural obstacles, when you say, hey, come here, come join us, and I have to walk through a landmine or a field of landmines, it's kind of, it's not really on you, but yet at the same time, at some point, the decision for addressing or being aware, I would not even say addressing, but being aware of some of these barriers is essential. So transformation means, you know, moving beyond accommodations. It's about systemic redesign. It's about redistributing the resources based on need and ensuring everyone can participate fully. Equity isn't a checklist. Equity is a moving target, and I'll say that for, you know, loudly a lot of times. Equity is about coordinating structural change. Disabled people must have a power, and there's a slogan in the disability community of nothing about us without us. And the author of Canary Code recently said, we've been nothing about us without us for so many years, it's time to say nothing without us. So we have, this is again by CBM Global Inclusion Advisory Group and the Pacific Disability Forum, which is actually an Australian disability-led group. I tend to go more to the UN, United Nations framework, because I've found that to be more responsive than a lot of the American, United States frameworks for disability inclusion. So this is the preconditions, they say preconditions for inclusion, disability inclusion. I say preconditions for equity. And it's ultimately, it's an interconnected and it's an ecosystem. It's a lot of different moving pieces all at the same time. So when you think about it, and you think about each pillar will support the others, and then there's foundational supports that support all of the different things that we do. So the pillars include non-discrimination, which is, in the United States, we have some proactive policies or proactive laws. However, most of them lack accountability. So until that accountability is factored in to ensure compliance with those laws alone do not protect disabled people. Systems prevent it, these systems, my notes are all wrong on that one. But anyway, so support services is another one. Peer networks. I will be a accessibility liaison at a conference in San Jose next weekend. Yeah, well, the 18th. And it's the first time in San Jose or at the University, San Jose State, that's kind of getting incorporated in. And it's largely not because I'm going to be able to mitigate the barriers, but as an access coordinator or accessibility liaison, I'm there to help advocate for the people that encounter barriers. I'm also there to amplify those barriers. Because in any day, I usually expect 6 to 8 barriers in a day. Hopefully none of them totally derail me, but ultimately in every space, because this world is not designed for somebody with a disability, I know that I have to anticipate the energy and the ability to navigate those things. Accessible assistive technology is something I'm seeing more and more within library spaces. I think it always existed in library spaces, but the gaps that exist are kind of like, do we know that this device isn't what's used by members in our community? So looking at those things. Accessibility, let's start including more universal design in built environments, transportation, and flexible policies that work in practice. When we plan a space, plan for seating, interpreters, service animals, you end up needing to reduce the seating in a room. So when you set a room up for a meeting has a capacity of 30, it's actually estimated 30% reduction in the overall seats in that room should be anticipated if you have multiple people expected with disabilities. The foundational supports around these pillars include participation and empowerment. This is where disabled people need to lead in the decisions. When you make a disability program, are you asking the disability community? Are you asking parents and service providers, or are you asking the actual disabled person what they want? Oftentimes when I see special needs or differently abled coming out in language, I know that the parents and service providers may be consulted more than anything else. There's nothing wrong with that. That's also an important demographic to include in those decision-making spaces, but did it get all the way down to the person with a disability? As I mentioned with the barriers, there's extra costs with disabilities. So much like when you plan for language interpretation, have you considered ASL as one of those languages? American Sign Language is one of those languages. Oftentimes it's not. I even had an argument with AI recently about that, where I was like, I said, I want this question on a forum as language interpretation. And it's like, well, that's Spanish and Vietnamese. And I'm like, no, it includes American Sign Language. AI was like, well, that's an accommodation. And I'm like, okay, right there is the bias. Because that's what we don't always catch. That's what's normal. So how do we make a different normal? Community inclusion, which includes the programs and partnerships. The other thing that's hugely important is data collection. If you're asking about every other demographic, variable, gender, age, whatever, why aren't you asking about disabled status, such as, do you self-identify as having a disability? Disability is undercounted in the United States. And the only way we're going to advance on that is through that self-identification process. So each of these pieces reinforce the other pieces. And if we're missing any part of these pieces, and especially the non-discrimination with accountability, you're not going to reach fully inclusive space. And then framing this as an ecosystem highlights that equity is not a checklist. It's a coordinated system, has multiple moving pieces, and everybody has to be involved in knowing and understanding what those processes are. If you're told you're on your own and you have to make something accessible, it won't be accessible because no one person can do all of that. So it's an unrealistic expectation. So I've kind of gone over, why the preconditions matter. I'm trying to remember how long I have is it until noon? Or, yeah, okay. Just making sure. So, ultimately the preconditions matter because without them we get stuck. And that was the point I was trying to make of if you are the one person pushing for accessibility and inclusion in your library space and you're unsupported and underfunded, it's not going to happen. And this kind of dovetails nicely with the prior presentation on the advocacy, because right now one of the things that we can get funded through private foundations and through not so much government funding, some government, local government maybe, but through private foundations are disability-based initiatives. And it's a good place for us to make some significant change when we can, to then fold into later into our better programming as things go, hopefully in a better place. When compliance is about checking boxes, and accessibility is about retrofitting old systems, and those systems weren't designed for me to start with. I mean, I still can't get through many doorways because they're designed for a smaller wheelchair and not my wheelchair. I once had a doctor give me a 26-inch wheelchair that was a push wheelchair, and I swear that one didn't fit anywhere. So it was kind of like, you can take this back now. I didn't want to spend my money on it. But ultimately, inclusion is about like inviting people into the spaces, and these spaces don't work for me. So when I don't show up, there's a reason why. And as any service provider of any service, we have to ask why. And that's ultimately kind of what this boils down to, is we really do need to look at why. And without looking at that, we aren't going to achieve a better world. We need, if we address these preconditions when we build the core infrastructure and the foundational elements into our systems from the start, we can actually do that, and disabled people can fully participate. Disabled people won't be afraid to ask you what your accommodation policies are because you won't have them buried on one page on a website that takes me 7 steps to actually find. Why is it not on the event description itself? Because event descriptions are the easiest place to put, hey, if you need an accommodation. But now accommodations are also me asking permission to be in a space. So usually anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks in advance, I may have to ask permission to attend something, ask a group of people to restructure their whole process to accommodate me. What happens if I'm sick that day? I've just put a whole lot of people through a whole lot of work that doesn't make me happy and probably didn't make them happy either. And so I get skittish about even RSVPing to things when I don't know for sure if I can attend. But what if that accommodation was planned in at the beginning and I didn't have to ask permission to be in the room? So there are some things that have costs attached to it that realistically we can't offer universally unless we know for sure that that population is going to be there. We see it more and more with different language interpretations automatically being included in some programs. Haven't yet fully seen it with ASL, but it's getting better. And ultimately, all of these things aren't just nice to have, they're essential in order to make that transformation. I'm gonna go a little bit sideways here for a second, but I wanna talk about and this kind of ties into the money thing. I want to talk about the United Nations. When they they drafted the Convention on Rights of People with Disabilities, persons with disabilities, in 2006. So think 1990 was when the ADA was passed. By 2006, the United Nations kind of realized that disabled people were not increasing in representation within their service programs and everything else. So they realized they had to do something different. So they drafted this Convention on Rights with People with Disabilities. The twin track approach kind of addresses those structural barriers while at the same time addressing the system supports that an individual might need. So those, track one is mainstreaming, integrating disability into our measures, into our policies, into our practices, having a disability advisory board, advising us on how to do, paying disabled people to consult and, do these lovely things. But it's integrating disability-specific measures into things. Track two, though, is also targeted at empowering disabled people themselves. We have to build up the resource capacity and, of many people in society are struggling right now. And I think this is where I'm also an advocate for the unhoused, and a lot of what I do includes kind of, because access needs to me are human needs, those access needs are also held by unhoused people, and the struggle points are held by everybody, right? And you still get the competing access needs, so we just have to plan for those elements in advance. So ultimately, this approach, it sets out to the rights of people with disabilities to fully participate, and when the preconditions are in place, it gives us a both-and approach to making the changes that are needed. Because if we just do all the surface level things, if we just empower disabled people, we're still leaving this whole other group behind, which can create, and we may not have the funding to do that other track of the higher level policy work. So it's like, when everything is working and we're making progress, this gives us a way to make kind of progress in both directions, both internally and externally. So this is my framework for you all. And the framework for change is basically 4 questions that brings everything together. It's how we move from understanding barriers and preconditions to actually creating the change that we want to see. You start by looking at the outcomes. If disabled people are struggling to be in your space, if you're having the vocal person in the lobby that's yelling at you for trash bins in the bathroom stalls, those things are a clue. They're a hint that you need to go deeper. You need to look at what's going on. You need to ask why. And it tells you something's wrong, typically not with you and what the work that you're doing on a day in and day out basis, but it's a problem with the policy or the structural laws that exist. So it's with the system, it's not with individual people. So question 1 would help you identify the specific barriers that we discussed earlier, the historic, the socioeconomic, the access, the discrimination. And that is what makes disability inclusion difficult here in this situation or scenario. Question 2 will get to the heart of it. Which of our preconditions are missing? Because you may be able to address things at an immediate level, but it may be more to do with that deeper level. So instead of just looking for the immediate, what's missing in the preconditions? Does this person not have their support worker with them or their support animal with them? Is it just a bad day, which happens to? But, and then do we offer those services to people? Do we offer those supports to people? How can we push to create some of these changes? Is it a core infrastructure like non-discrimination policies, or do we have the wrong model or the wrong update on the JAWS machine that blows up makes text larger, or the one that reads out loud? And different people use different programs, and it really gets confusing because also different programs, like if you're using Microsoft Word and you shift to a different program, the accessibility features are all different, so somebody can get lost if it's the wrong program as well. So question 3 kind of connects the dots. How do these missing preconditions impact people's daily lives and their participation? And then question 4 kind of brings about, can we fix the underlying system? Do we have power here? Or is this something we have to figure out a way to address more at a local level and work towards that systemic change down the road? So this framework is a tool that is about helping you guys move from retrofitting solutions and accommodations into kind of thinking more about the true system transformation. You know, instead of asking, how do we help disabled people fit into our broken system, because trust me, it's kind of broken, you know, how do we build systems that work for everyone from the start? And that's the shift of inclusion to equity that I've been kind of talking about throughout this. Now, I think we have time to do the exercise, right? Okay, so we can pass out. The handouts are to be shared. We're going to kind of do a small group exercise. First, I'm going to just highlight disability justice as a framework because somebody complained recently that I didn't do it. There's reasons why I don't, but disability justice is a framework that was created by people of color, largely mostly marginalized queer, trans, black and brown people that realized the disability rights movement in the United States wasn't addressing the core needs. Disability rights gave people access to spaces sometimes, but it didn't fix all the problems in housing, it didn't fix the problems in transportation, it didn't fix those other problems. So these amazing groups of activists got together. Patty Byrne just passed away. She was considered kind of one of the original frame makers of this. And this is ultimately an intersectional approach that centers the most marginalized within disability communities and explicitly addresses the root causes of ableism. So its principles include being intersectional. Initiatives are led by those most impacted and placed most at risk by society. So it's led by predominantly disabled people of color. It values all bodies. There's a saying of this is, we are exactly who we need to be in this moment in time. It may not always feel that way, but ultimately within disability justice is where I was able to unlearn a lot of my own internalized ableism that I carried around. And I'm not including this as a replacement for any of the other frameworks, but it is a tool that, and there's, in the slide deck, there's one of the resources I share is actually a disability audit tool that you can kind of, in small groups with your teams, you can actually evaluate where are we at with inclusion of people and what may be stopping us, you know, so that's more of a personal level kind of thing. But disability justice is another lens for raising awareness and guiding deeper systemic thinking. So now to the handout thing. Basically, you know, this exercise is about sharing what your experiences are, what you see happening in your own libraries and in your own spaces. You can do this individually and just reflect on it, or you can do it in pairs or small groups. You know, are you building disability equity beyond compliance and or access? The handout breaks down into the 8 areas of the core pillars and then the foundational elements that I went over briefly earlier. You can use the reflection question that's at the very bottom of the handout. There's a reflection question that is, where is your library strongest? Where do you see the most opportunity for change? In the handout, there's reflection questions under each of the elements, but then there's also examples and actions as just ways to kind of reflect, hey, we do that, you know, and that's a good thing. So we're just gonna kind of pair up with somebody and take a few minutes to just talk about 1 or 2 of the areas or something that's striking to you. And after that, you know, I think we have still a good bit of time, right? Yeah. So we'll have time to do this, and then we'll debrief a little bit after. I'm like in a time warp right now because every time I look up the clock, I swear it's the same time, only 2 minutes later. I'm a little nervous today for some reason. I'm not always nervous when I speak publicly, but today I guess I am. Anyways, after you guys talk, we'll kind of do a debrief on that, and if anybody has any questions at that point, the rest of my slide deck is mostly resources and things like that. So let's start the activity. Any questions about the activity before I have everybody talk to other people? I can't. Here's one more handout. Yeah, it'll have to be small groups. I'm sorry. I did this last minute. I threw this in last minute, and I threw our event coordinators off because I was like, I'll print 50. I don't know how many people are going to be here. But go ahead and the handout will be sent to people with the after event materials as well, so that you guys can take it to your library and kind of work on it there.
We have it pulled up on the screen now, too, if that's helpful.
Probably just a couple more minutes to wrap up your thoughts, and then we'll do some Q&A after that. Let's wrap up the conversations, and then we'll have time for Q&A too. And like I said, that handout is a tool that you guys can take with you. It'll be available with the materials that are sent out after the event. So was there anything like really difficult? I mean, you guys were all having amazing conversations, so hopefully that was a good sign. So.
Oh, wait. What that happened? Sorry, I hit the wrong thing.
So that was a good sign? All righty. Let me, just go to the resource one, slide 18 probably.
It's catching up.
Yeah, it's catching up.
Yeah, I went to the slide we were on, but it's just been slow.
Right. It's all good. Let's go one more. Okay, so in the slide deck that should be sent out after also, I have resources that are on disability and language resources, disability justice resources, and then the visual materials that I used in this presentation, there's also a page of those resources. I have a Power of Language handout. I have a longer kind of bibliography of resources that are in my presentation resources, and then the CBM Global link is also there, and then disability justice, and the Northwest Health is the audit tool that you guys could do internally, like with teams in your libraries. It's an amazing resource. Stacy Park Milburn and Leah Lakshmi Pips, it's a longer name, and I'm horrible with names. Pipsna Samransina is she's phenomenal, author of Care Work, also Disabled Future, and amazing presenter on kind of the disability equity as well as disability justice type topics. And then, like I said, the last slide is just kind of the different graphics that I used, and then the State of the State report is there. So now let's open it up to questions, comments, other things, and I don't know how you guys navigate that with microphones probably. Anybody?
I have a question, and I have a loud voice, so it's going to be okay. You don't need the mic. Is there a library that you have visited or talked at that where it was accessible to you, totally accessible to you? Is there a blueprint or something that with those who have sight that we can look at and see this is what it's supposed to look like? Because it's very hard to explain to people certain things that need to be in your space when they have sight and they need to see it.
Right. So it's not a library that I would recommend. If you're local. No, so there are, let me start over again. what I will say is there are many spaces in many libraries that are really, really beautifully done. And there are many spaces that can be expanded and be improved, especially for somebody who might be low vision. There are amazing ways, like Haben Girma is an amazing video person to watch. I attended a talk with her recently that educated me beyond what I even knew I needed to be educated on. But she goes around and tours museums and other spaces in other countries, and she kind of highlights the best practices. And what's surprising to me is how clueless we are about those practices. So really the answers to find are within the disability community on what you can do better in the library spaces that each of us has. The other variable, the space I would highlight is, and now I'm, Ed Roberts campus, the Center for Independent Living, which was a universally designed building. There's also the Kelsey is an apartment complex that's here in San Francisco, and there's also one in San Jose that was a disability forward housing project, and they have a whole guide of how to do things better, to how to in building spaces. But ultimately, my experience, especially with disability, is I get invited at a point into giving advice when all the decisions were already made. So I was invited to a housing evaluation, and they literally wanted us to tell them what color tables to get. And they couldn't even, the things that they were having us do, the commenting on, there was one person in the group that was low vision, and she's a good friend of mine, and she was like, what's here? What are we doing? You know, and it was all virtual, so it was like literally half of the engagement was cut from the start, you know, because even though this group knows a lot about one type of disability, predominantly neurodivergence, that group didn't know enough about competing access needs, which I think are the most complicated element to balance in society. But similar to what you're saying about you know, what exists, what have you guys, somebody talked about the affinity rooms here. Is there a disability affinity room in this library? Why or why not? Go ahead. But those are services. Those aren't about my life. Those are where, that's great to have, but was it deemed that a disability community could be an affinity group in this library? Yeah, so that's you know, there's a bias that's there. Yeah, thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your knowledge with us and experience. My name is Anna. I'm wondering, can you give an example of what an affinity space looks like?
So, sorry, did I cut you
no,
off?
that
Okay.
Yeah, that was my.
Believe it or not, there's a video on the internet. From the Midwest, it's a new organization called the Lois Curtis Center. And Lois Curtis was a woman that was very involved with the Olmstead Act, where, you know, the right to live independently in society. And it was a Supreme Court case. But the Lois Curtis campus recently shared a video where they were setting up their lending library. And they did a video that highlighted what all was included and how they arranged it and how it was accessible, what resources and services were available, which are hugely important because they don't really, having to hunt and find those things sometimes, it's amazing how many people don't know what exists. And that's where, but what they're doing at the Lois Curtis Center is they actually are not really a traditional disability service provider center. They're creating kind of that bridge for the people in the gap. You know, the people that are lower income, the people that are multiply marginalized because of race and gender or sexual orientation, poverty, and disability, or those that are service providers. They have washing machines there, they have showers there, they have artist in residence programs, and they're a fairly new organization. I think 3 to 5 years is all the time that they've had. They've remodeled an old school into a space. I want to see more spaces like that because disability is everywhere, but yet it's nowhere at the same time because society says it's something that's abnormal or stigmatized as different. And ultimately, that's the power we all have, is we can start to normalize access needs as human needs. So on my website, there's also my founder's manifesto for all things disability equity. I founded the organization because it's very hard to meet my disability needs at the same time as I can't fit into a 40-hour-a-week job, because I have a lot of other things that I manage. I can't, it's very difficult, so I needed to create my own solution. And part of creating that own solution also includes the leadership development approach and the things like that, where I want to bring more of the disability and expertise that we all have. We've navigated barriers regularly. We're creative, we're amazing, we can make do with less, right? But yet we need more of those people that are facilitated to be in the room, and that's the leadership development part of what I'm trying to do, is to first off, the imposter syndrome is really, really real as as somebody in a non-traditional kind of, my whole career trajectory has not really been traditional. I stand out like a sore thumb in many spaces because I'm fairly frank about what I say. My manifesto actually says disability is not the problem, society is. So it's very clear where the barriers are. And the hope is the best way to reach the solution to the question from the back about what places exist. We need to create those spaces by calling the people with disabilities in our community and having listening sessions, especially now, because it's underreported how deeply impacted the disability community is today. We've had funding cuts in education. Libraries are getting cut left and right, which are core essential services for some of us. We've had services, I have to literally ponder what it will be like if I am, like in 2008, 2009, my supportive services, my personal assistant that I have in home with me, what if that gets cut the same amount it was cut then? And it's likely going to be more because the budget deficit is greater right now. So these are the realities, and now is the time to do these listening sessions. We see the listening sessions, and here's the other thing about disability. It doesn't discriminate. It crosses race, gender, class, ethnicity, all of those things, education level, all of those things. And anybody can join this community at any time. And that's kind of a really down note to leave this on. But it's a true note. So any kind of last uplifting question? We've got 5 minutes. I could tell you all about my cat Bug. She's my emotional support animal. She's like too much and everything all at once. So she's still a kitten, so she drives me little crazy. But she would fit into my shirt, and now she thinks that's her spot. So I was trying to do this presentation for you all, and she would grab my mouse and start moving it around. Anyway, that's a good note to end on, I think. So.
Thank you so much, Michelle. We are now going on our lunch break. We will be opening up the Latina room at 1 o'clock, so you're welcome to come and network. And then we have our next presenter on at 1:30, so please be back in this room at 1:30. Thank you.